October 1917, in a single night, an entire army vanished. Caporetto, the night Italy lost its army. What happened in those dark hours would reshape a nation and shock the world. This is the story of how one battle changed everything. Subscribe for more untold World War I stories that still haunt history. On the morning of October 24, 1917, at 2 o'clock in the darkness, the Italian front simply ceased to exist. What began as a coordinated assault by German stormtroopers and Austro-Hungarian forces would transform into one of the First World War's most catastrophic military collapses. The Italians had held their mountain positions for 2 years, bleeding through brutal campaigns along the Isonzo River. But on this October night, surprise and innovation shattered their defenses in ways the High Command never anticipated. The bombardment came first, intense grenade and gas fire that choked the trenches and poisoned the mountain air. Then came the infiltration tactics, small German units moving through fog and darkness, bypassing strongpoints entirely, exploiting the very terrain their commanders believed impenetrable. By dawn, the Italian lines were fragmenting. By the first day's end, German forces had advanced 25 kilometers, a distance that seemed impossible in the static warfare of the Western Front. Within days, nearly 1 million Italians were retreating in chaos toward Venice. Soldiers abandoned positions, refugees streamed from villages. The Italian army that had fought for years in frozen mountain passes was collapsing into disorder. The question wasn't whether Italy could hold, it was whether the nation could survive the catastrophe at all. This is the story of how a single night transformed the war in the south, shattered an army, and nearly knocked Italy from the conflict entirely. The Italian front in October of 1917 stood as a monument to exhaustion. For more than 2 years, the armies of Italy had clawed at the mountains and valleys of the Isonzo River, a waterway that had become less a geographic feature and more a graveyard of military ambition. The landscape itself seemed to resist the very notion of victory. Jagged peaks rose like broken teeth against pale skies. Limestone cliffs offered neither shelter nor mercy. The terrain was so punishing that soldiers whispered of a third enemy beyond the Austro-Hungarians and Germans. The land itself appeared determined to kill them all. The Isonzo had witnessed 11 separate major offensives. 11. Each one had promised breakthrough. Each one had delivered only more names for the casualty lists. Italian General Luigi Cadorna, commander of the Italian Expeditionary Force, had repeatedly assured Rome that the next assault would crack the Austro-Hungarian lines. The next offensive would be decisive. The next push would shatter enemy morale and open the road to victory. These assurances had become as predictable as the autumn rains that turned the mountain passes into rivers of mud. By autumn of 1917, the Italian army was a force stretched beyond the limits of human endurance. The ranks had been depleted and refilled so many times that entire divisions consisted largely of conscripts, men pulled from villages and factories with minimal training, thrust into an industrial meat grinder they could barely comprehend. Letters home, when soldiers were permitted to write them, spoke of cold that penetrated bone, of hunger that never quite ended, of the constant presence of death in forms both sudden and agonizing. The morale, despite official reports claiming otherwise, was fragmenting like old glass. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, however, faced its own desperation. Austria-Hungary was crumbling from within, resources dwindled, the dual monarchy's economy, never robust, was now barely functioning. The Central Powers needed a victory that would demonstrate strength and resolve, something to counter the growing sense that the war might be slipping beyond their grasp. In Vienna and Berlin, military strategists had begun to recognize that the Italian front represented an opportunity. The Italians, for all their numerical strength, were vulnerable. They were tired, they were poorly supplied. They were, in a word, ripe for a decisive blow. This was the strategic context that gave birth to what the Germans called Operation Wagenstellung, the wagon position. The plan emerged from collaboration between German and Austro-Hungarian high command. The concept was revolutionary for the time. Rather than a conventional frontal assault relying on mass and attrition, the operation would employ new infiltration tactics developed on the Western Front. German stormtroopers, elite assault units trained in rapid fluid movement, would punch through the Italian lines. They would exploit gaps and bypass strong points rather than assaulting them directly. They would flood through the breach like water seeking the lowest ground, leaving organized resistance to be mopped up by follow-on forces. The German General Staff selected an ideal location for this operation. The Isonzo River near the small town of Caporetto offered terrain that was tactically favorable. The valley narrowed there, and the Italian positions, while strongly fortified in some sectors, showed weaknesses. German reconnaissance had identified gaps in the Italian defensive line. More importantly, the Germans had detected that Italian artillery was poorly coordinated and that ammunition supplies were lower than they should have been. The Austro-Hungarian 14th Army, under the command of General Svetozar Borovic, would launch the initial assault. German divisions would pour through the breach that was created. The operation was scheduled for the morning of October 24th. The date had been selected with careful attention to weather patterns. October weather in the mountains brought fog, thick, impenetrable fog that rolled through the valleys before dawn. This fog would provide concealment for the assault force. It would blind Italian observers and make artillery spotting nearly impossible. It would give the attackers an advantage that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. In the days before the assault, the Austro-Hungarian and German forces massed in secret. Troops moved at night, supplies were cached in concealed positions, artillery pieces were carefully positioned to deliver maximum firepower on the first day. The operation involved approximately 250,000 Austro-Hungarian and German soldiers. They were opposed by roughly 500,000 Italian troops, but those Italian soldiers were scattered across a wide front, many of them in second-line positions, many of them poorly equipped, many of them unaware that something catastrophic was about to occur. The Italian High Command, despite having intelligence suggesting an imminent offensive, had not fully grasped the scale or the sophistication of what was coming. General Cadorna believed the attack would come further north, in the Trentino sector. Italian intelligence reports had been contradictory and unclear. Some officers sensed that something was wrong with the quality of the intelligence they were receiving, but the fog of war, literal fog in this case, obscured the true picture. The Italian army on the Isonzo remained unaware that they were about to face not merely another offensive, but a revolutionary new form of warfare. The soldiers in the Italian trenches and fortifications knew only what their officers told them. In the forward positions, men cleaned rifles and waited. They had waited so many times before. They had endured 11 previous offensives. Some of them had survived all 11. Those men carried a terrible knowledge. They knew what was coming, and they knew they might not survive it. The younger conscripts, many of them barely more than boys, did not carry this knowledge. They were nervous, certainly, but they had not yet learned the particular horror of mass casualties on an industrial scale. In the rear areas, the Italian supply system was straining under the weight of maintaining such a large army in such difficult terrain. Transport lines stretched back for miles, supply depots were scattered across the mountainous landscape. The logistical system, while adequate for maintaining static positions, was not designed for rapid movement or sudden changes in the situation. If the front collapsed, if the army had to retreat, the supply system would become increasingly vulnerable. There was a fragility to the entire structure that only became apparent when the structure itself began to fail. The night of October the 23rd descended on the Isonzo with the weight of destiny. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The fog began to form in the valleys as the temperature dropped. Austro-Hungarian and German assault troops moved into their final positions. Artillery units made final preparations. Officers checked watches and maps. The machinery of war, vast and complex, was being wound tight, ready to be released with devastating force. Italian sentries in the forward trenches noticed nothing unusual. The night was quiet, too quiet perhaps, but that observation was not made by anyone with authority to act on it. The men huddled in their positions, many of them trying to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day, like so many other days. None of them knew that tomorrow would be different. None of them knew that the night of October 23rd would mark the moment when the Italian front began its catastrophic transformation from a line of resistance into a route of retreat. The political context that had created this moment extended back through years of calculation and misalignment. Italy had entered the Great War in 1915, joining the Entente powers in hopes of territorial gain at the expense of Austria-Hungary. The promise was the acquisition of Italian-speaking lands held by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, territories that Italian nationalists had coveted for decades. The war was supposed to be short. It was supposed to be victorious. It was supposed to transform Italy into a major European power. By 1917, those promises had worn thin. The war had consumed resources and lives with no end in sight. The Italian public, initially supportive of the war effort, had grown weary. Workers in the industrial cities were restless. Soldiers returning from the front brought stories of incompetence and waste. The government in Rome was divided. Some officials wanted to continue the war to the bitter end. Others whispered about the possibility of negotiated peace. The military leadership, particularly General Cadorna, remained committed to victory through offensive operations. But even Cadorna was beginning to sense that something fundamental was shifting. The soldiers themselves carried the weight of this political uncertainty. They were fighting for abstract concepts, national glory, territorial expansion, the honor of Italy, but they were suffering very concrete and immediate consequences. The casualty rates from the previous 11 offensives had been staggering. Italian official records would eventually acknowledge approximately 100,000 killed and another 250,000 wounded in the Isonzo campaigns. Those numbers represented not merely statistics, but entire lives. Young men who would never return home, who would never marry or have children, who would never see their families again. The culture of the Italian army in 1917 was beginning to show signs of strain. Discipline remained firm, enforced by officers who understood that an army without discipline was merely a mob. But morale was another matter entirely. The men knew they were being sent against well-fortified positions held by determined defenders. They knew the odds. They knew that their officers, no matter how capable, could not make the mountains less steep or the enemy less prepared to kill them. The geographic reality of the Isonzo front was that it favored the defender. The Austro-Hungarian forces held the high ground in most sectors. They had spent years fortifying their positions. Machine gun nests were sited to create overlapping fields of fire. Artillery was positioned to rake the valley floors. Barbed wire entanglements, multiple layers deep, protected the front lines. Any attacker crossing the open ground between the opposing lines was exposed to devastating fire. This was why the previous 11 offensives had failed. This was why the 12th offensive, scheduled to begin on the morning of October 24th, was supposed to be different. The Austro-Hungarian soldiers holding these positions were themselves exhausted but resolute. They were defending their homeland. They were fighting against an enemy that sought to dismember their empire. Many of them had been in the trenches for years. They understood the terrain intimately. They knew exactly where the Italian attacks would come. They were prepared to resist with the grim determination of men who have no choice but to fight. The German divisions assigned to support the Austro-Hungarian offensive brought a different character to the operation. These were professional soldiers, many of them hardened by years of fighting on the Western Front. They had learned new tactics, new ways of fighting that emphasized speed and deception over brute force. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their ability to execute their part of the operation. They believed that German military skill and organization would prove decisive. As the night of October 23rd progressed toward the early hours of October 24th, the pieces of the operation were locked into place. The assault troops were in position, the artillery was ready, the supply lines had been organized, the commanders had received their final orders. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the signal would be given, the artillery would open fire, the assault troops would advance. The battle that would become known as Caporetto would begin. The name itself, Caporetto, was the Italian name for a small town in the valley. To the Austro-Hungarians and Germans, it was Karfreet. To history, it would become synonymous with catastrophic military defeat. But in the hours before the assault, as soldiers on both sides checked their weapons and tried to find whatever peace they could in the darkness, the name meant nothing. It was simply a location on a map, a place where the war would intensify, a spot where many men would die or be captured or be forever changed by what was about to occur. The origins of this moment, the military planning, the strategic calculation, the political context, the geographic reality, the state of morale and discipline, the technological innovations, the human factors, all of these elements had converged to create conditions for something unprecedented in the Italian experience of the Great War. The Italian army was about to face not merely another offensive, but a new form of warfare. The defensive positions that had held against 11 previous assaults were about to prove inadequate against infiltration tactics and coordinated assault. The army that had endured so much was about to be broken. None of this was yet known to the soldiers in the trenches, the officers in their command posts, or the government officials in Rome. The night of October 23rd held its secrets. The morning of October 24th would reveal them all. In the pre-dawn darkness of October the 24th, 1917, the Italian front erupted into chaos. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the Austro-Hungarian and German forces launched their assault with a ferocity that would transform a war of attrition into a war of movement. The night sky above the Isonzo Valley lit up with artillery fire, not the grinding, predictable bombardment that had characterized 2 years of static warfare, but something far more devastating. Intense barrages of grenades and chemical weapons poured down upon the Italian positions, followed immediately by waves of infiltrating infantry employing tactics that the Italian commanders had never encountered before. The Germans had brought their stormtroopers to the Italian front, elite assault troops trained in revolutionary infiltration methods. These were not formations designed for frontal assault. They were small, mobile units that sought out weaknesses in defensive lines, bypassed strongpoints, and spread chaos through the rear areas. They moved through the fog that clung to the valley floor, fog so thick that visibility extended barely 20 meters. Officers could not see their men. Artillery spotters could not identify targets. Communication broke down almost immediately. The fog, which meteorologists would later describe as unusually dense for the season, became an instrument of war itself, neutralizing Italian advantages in terrain knowledge and fortified positions. The initial breakthrough was staggering in its scale and rapidity. Within the first day alone, German and Austro-Hungarian forces advanced approximately 25 kilometers, exploiting not only the tactical surprise, but also the psychological shock of encountering an entirely new form of warfare. The Italian Second Army, commanded by General Luigi Capello, found itself facing an enemy that did not follow the rules of the brutal, grinding combat that had defined the Isonzo campaigns since 1915. The Second Army had endured 11 previous offensives along the Isonzo River. The cost had been astronomical. Hundreds of thousands of casualties accumulated in pursuit of modest territorial gains measured in meters rather than kilometers. The men were exhausted. Officers had rotated through the line so frequently that institutional knowledge of defensive positions remained fragmented. Supply lines stretched thin across difficult mountain terrain. The artillery, while substantial in quantity, suffered from ammunition shortages that had only worsened in recent weeks. And now, facing an enemy employing unfamiliar tactics in conditions of near total darkness and obscuring fog, the army's cohesion began to fracture. The German commander, General Otto von Below, had planned the operation with meticulous care. He had studied the Italian positions for months, identifying what he believed were critical weaknesses. His intelligence officers had correctly assessed that the Italian forces were stretched thin, that morale had deteriorated, and that the High Command's confidence in defensive capabilities had become dangerously overextended. The Austro-Hungarian forces, fighting on their own territory and motivated by the prospect of pushing back an invader, attacked with renewed vigor alongside their German allies. By the morning of October the 25th, the situation along the front had become dire. Italian units that had held their ground for years suddenly found themselves surrounded or cut off. Communication with higher command became sporadic. Divisional commanders received contradictory orders. Some officers attempted to organize counterattacks with the forces available to them, but these efforts failed repeatedly against the coordinated German-Austro-Hungarian onslaught. The fog began to lift as morning progressed, but by then the initial advantage had already been secured by the attackers. The withdrawal began almost immediately, though initially it lacked the character of an organized retreat. It was more accurately described as a collapse of the front line, followed by increasingly desperate attempts to establish new defensive positions further to the rear. The Italian forces fell back toward the Tagliamento River, a natural barrier that military planners had identified as a potential secondary defensive line. The distance between the original front and the Tagliamento was significant, approximately 40 kilometers in some sectors, but German forces advanced so rapidly that the possibility of organizing an effective defense seemed increasingly remote. The human dimension of this military catastrophe manifested itself in countless individual tragedies. Soldiers who had survived the grinding warfare of previous years found themselves suddenly fleeing in the face of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and unit cohesion as the retreat accelerated. Supply depots were abandoned. Wounded men who could not be evacuated were left behind. The roads leading westward from the Isonzo became clogged with retreating troops, refugees from the border regions, and the detritus of a military force in disarray. General Luigi Capello, the commander of the Second Army, issued orders attempting to slow the German advance and organize a fighting retreat. However, his authority over the situation was already slipping away. Some units obeyed orders. Others, their officers killed or missing, moved independently, following rumors of where the next defensive line might be established. The Italian Third Army, under the command of General Armando Diaz, attempted to provide support to the collapsing Second Army, but the speed of the German advance made coordinated action increasingly difficult. The Italian government in Rome received reports of the offensive, but the initial bulletins conveyed only partial understanding of the catastrophe unfolding in the northeast. General Luigi Cadorna, the chief of the Italian General Staff, had maintained command of the overall Italian forces, despite the Second Army's deteriorating situation. As reports accumulated throughout October 25th and 26th, the true scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Estimates of casualties began to circulate, thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded, and most alarming of all, tens of thousands of soldiers reported captured or missing. The advancing Germans encountered something that surprised even their most optimistic commanders: mass surrenders. Entire units, cut off from their command structure and convinced that further resistance was futile, laid down their weapons. Some soldiers, traumatized by the intensity of the assault and demoralized by the apparent collapse of the front, simply abandoned their positions and fled westward. By the end of October the 26th, German forces had captured such vast numbers of prisoners that their own logistical systems became overwhelmed. Prisoner-of-war camps established in the rear areas quickly filled beyond capacity. The German High Command found itself managing not a military victory but a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Primary source accounts from the period convey the surreal nature of the collapse. One Italian officer's letter, dated October 27th, describes encountering thousands of soldiers moving westward without officers, without organization, many still carrying their weapons but in a state of psychological shock. "They move like ghosts," the letter states, asking constantly where the line has been reformed, where they should go, whether the war is lost. Many weep openly. "I have never seen soldiers behave in this manner, even after the worst bombardments." The fog that had aided the German assault continued to play a role in the unfolding catastrophe, though its effects became increasingly ambiguous. As it cleared during daylight hours, it allowed German aircraft to conduct reconnaissance missions that revealed the extent of Italian disorganization. Conversely, the clearing of the fog made it possible for some Italian units to establish defensive positions based on clearer understanding of terrain. The weather itself became a character in the narrative of the battle, shaping tactical possibilities and constraining options for both sides. The Tagliamento River represented a critical geographic feature that took on enormous strategic significance as the battle developed. This river, flowing from the Alps toward the Adriatic Sea, presented a formidable natural obstacle. The German forces pushed toward it with remarkable speed, understanding that if they could establish a bridgehead across the river before the Italians could organize a comprehensive defense, the possibility of a complete breakthrough would become real. The race toward the Tagliamento thus became the defining element of the battle's middle phase. Italian forces attempted to establish defensive positions along the Tagliamento's western bank, but the arrival of German assault troops at the river's edge came with such speed that organized resistance proved nearly impossible. Small groups of Italian soldiers fought delaying actions, inflicting casualties on the advancing Germans, but unable to prevent the establishment of German bridgeheads. By November 2nd, 1917, German forces had successfully crossed the Tagliamento River, forcing the Italians to abandon any hope of defending that line. The scale of Italian losses during this phase of the battle began to crystallize in official reports. Approximately 30,000 soldiers had been wounded in the fighting, but more shocking than the wounded were the captured. Approximately 265,000 Italian soldiers fell into German or Austro-Hungarian captivity. These figures represented not merely military casualties, but a catastrophic loss of manpower that Italy could ill afford in the fourth year of a grinding continental war. The political implications of the military disaster became apparent almost immediately. In Rome, the government faced a crisis of confidence. How had the front collapsed so completely? Where had the intelligence failures occurred? Why had commanders not anticipated the possibility of such an assault? Questions that would occupy historians for decades began to circulate among politicians and military officials in the immediate aftermath of the defeat. General Luigi Cadorna's authority came under scrutiny, though he maintained his command for the moment. The retreat continued westward, unit by unit, division by division. Italian forces moved toward the Piave River, a secondary defensive line that had been prepared in the weeks before the German offensive, but with less thoroughness than the fortifications along the Isonzo. The Piave, flowing north to south through northeastern Italy, offered another natural barrier, but the question of whether Italian forces could organize effective resistance along this line remained uncertain. The army that had fought for 2 years along the Isonzo was now in flight, its command structure compromised, its morale shattered, its confidence in leadership severely tested. The development of the battle during these crucial days from late October through early November demonstrated the power of operational surprise combined with tactical innovation. The German stormtroopers, employing infiltration tactics perfected on the Western Front, had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Italian defensive posture. The static, fortified nature of the Italian positions, designed to resist conventional artillery bombardment and frontal assault, proved vulnerable to small mobile units that bypassed strongpoints and spread through rear areas, creating chaos and confusion. Military commanders on both sides recognized that something historic was occurring. This was not merely a local tactical defeat. This was a collapse of an entire front, a phenomenon that had not been seen on the European continent since the opening weeks of the war in 1914. The implications extended far beyond the immediate military situation. If the Austro-Hungarian and German forces could break through the Piave line, the way to northern Italy would lie open. The industrial heartland of Italy, the cities of Milan and Turin, the economic and political center of Italian power, all could potentially be threatened. The Italian soldiers who participated in the retreat carried with them traumatic memories that would endure for decades. Men who had endured 2 years of grinding trench warfare, who had survived bombardments and gas attacks and the terrible casualties of previous Isonzo offensives, now found themselves fleeing an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The psychological impact of the collapse extended beyond mere military demoralization. It represented a fundamental rupture in the narrative that had sustained Italian participation in the war, the narrative that Italian sacrifice would eventually achieve victory, that the front would hold, that further blood would purchase territorial gains and ultimate triumph. As October gave way to November, the focus of the battle shifted from the question of whether the front could be held to the question of whether Italy itself could be defended. The German advance had achieved a penetration of such depth that the entire strategic situation in northeastern Europe appeared to be transforming before the eyes of Allied commanders. The British and French, who had been skeptical of Italian military capabilities for years, now confronted the possibility that Italy might actually collapse as a belligerent. The implications for the entire Allied war effort were profound and deeply troubling. The rise of the German offensive and the development of the battle thus represented a turning point, not merely for Italy but for the entire complex of Allied military operations in Europe. What had begun as a surprise assault on October 24th had by the beginning of November evolved into a genuine strategic crisis. The question was no longer whether the Germans could achieve a tactical victory. The question had become whether they could achieve a strategic breakthrough that would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the European continent. The collapse came not as a dramatic moment of heroic last stands, but rather as a cascading series of decisions made by desperate men in impossible circumstances. By the third day of the offensive, the scale of the Italian disaster had become unmistakable to those who possessed the clarity of mind to recognize it. The German stormtrooper tactics, which had seemed almost miraculous in their initial success, continued to prove devastatingly effective as they exploited every weakness in the fractured Italian defensive positions. The fog that had cloaked the first hours of the assault had lifted, but by then, the momentum of the Central Powers' advance had become irreversible. On the 26th of October, 2 days after the initial bombardment, General Luigi Capello, commander of the Second Army, made a fateful decision. Recognizing that his forces were being systematically outflanked and overwhelmed, he authorized a general retreat. This decision, though tactically sound given the circumstances, would transform a military setback into a catastrophe. The retreat, once begun, proved impossible to control. Soldiers who had endured years of grinding positional warfare, who had suffered through countless failed offensives and the endless casualties of trench combat, suddenly found themselves ordered backward. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. For many of these men, retreat meant abandonment of the very positions they had bled to defend, the very ground they had been told was essential to Italian national security. The German forces, sensing the disintegration of Italian cohesion, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. The stormtrooper units, composed of specially trained infiltration troops equipped with hand grenades and light machine guns, continued their tactics of bypassing strongpoints and attacking command centers directly. These tactics, revolutionary in their application during this war, demonstrated the potential of modern infantry assault methods. The German soldiers moved in small groups, taking advantage of terrain and exploiting gaps in the line rather than engaging in frontal assaults. This methodical penetration of the Italian defenses created a sense of encirclement, even where complete encirclement did not exist. Soldiers in isolated positions, receiving conflicting orders and uncertain of the location of higher command, increasingly made the decision to surrender rather than fight to the death for positions that were being systematically abandoned. The Italian Second Army, which had held the Isonzo sector, began to dissolve. Entire regiments, their officers either killed or missing, lost cohesion within hours. Soldiers who had served together for years found themselves separated from their units in the chaos of retreat. The roads leading westward became clogged with military traffic and refugees. Ammunition wagons, supply columns, and artillery pieces competed for space, with exhausted infantrymen attempting to withdraw. The advance of the Central Powers was so rapid that supply lines became difficult to establish. Yet the Germans and Austro-Hungarians continued to push forward, driving deeper into Italian territory with each passing day. By the first day of November, German forces had advanced more than 25 kilometers from their starting positions, a remarkable distance given the mountainous terrain and the intensity of the fighting. The political ramifications of this military catastrophe began to manifest almost immediately. In Rome, the government of Prime Minister Paolo Boselli attempted to maintain public confidence even as reports of the disaster accumulated. Official Italian communiques announced the withdrawal, but framed it in language designed to suggest strategic necessity rather than military failure. Yet the truth could not be contained. Soldiers who managed to escape the encirclement brought with them stories of chaos, of units being surrounded, of entire divisions ceasing to exist as organized military forces. The newspapers, constrained by military censorship, yet unable to ignore the obvious scale of the defeat, published increasingly alarmed accounts. By the 4th of November, it became clear that the Italian front had collapsed entirely. The casualty figures from the first days of the offensive were staggering. Approximately 10,000 Italian soldiers were killed in the initial assault and subsequent fighting. Another 30,000 were wounded, many of them left behind in the rapid retreat and subsequently taken prisoner by the advancing Central Powers. Most devastating of all, as the Italian forces retreated and became increasingly disorganized, approximately 265,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. These numbers represented not merely military losses, but the destruction of entire units, the capture of tens of thousands of men who would spend the remainder of the war in captivity. The scale of the prisoner haul demonstrated the complete breakdown of Italian military organization. Soldiers surrendered en masse, not necessarily from cowardice, but from the practical reality that continued resistance seemed futile when surrounded or cut off from their units. The Italian First Army, under the command of General Duke of Aosta, attempted to establish a more coherent defense further back, but the rapid pace of the German and Austro-Hungarian advance made this difficult. The Central Powers forces, exploiting the breakthrough achieved by the stormtroopers, began to consolidate their gains. Austro-Hungarian infantry followed in the wake of the German assault troops, establishing positions and attempting to prevent Italian counterattacks. The coordination between German and Austro-Hungarian forces, though sometimes imperfect, remained sufficient to maintain the momentum of the offensive. The Germans, who had provided the shock troops and the tactical innovation, were content to allow the Austro-Hungarians to hold ground while they continued to advance towards strategic objectives. By the 2nd of November, German divisions had reached the Tagliamento River, a significant geographical barrier that many military observers believed might provide an opportunity for the Italians to establish a new defensive line. The Tagliamento represented a last natural obstacle before the Piave River, and the Piave was considered the final defensible position before the Italian heartland. If the Germans could establish a bridgehead across the Tagliamento, the possibility of containing the offensive would diminish dramatically. The Italian command, recognizing the critical importance of this river crossing, attempted to organize a defense. However, the demoralization of the troops, the continuing chaos of retreat, and the aggressive pursuit of the Central Powers forces made establishing an effective defense extraordinarily difficult. The German forces, displaying the same tactical innovation that had characterized their assault tactics, established a bridgehead across the Tagliamento. Italian counterattacks, launched with units that were themselves demoralized and disorganized, failed to dislodge the Germans. The Austro-Hungarian forces, meanwhile, continued to advance on a broader front, threatening to encircle Italian positions and cut off avenues of retreat. The situation became increasingly desperate. Italian commanders faced an impossible choice between attempting to hold positions that were being systematically outflanked or authorizing further retreat. Each retreat, while necessary to preserve what remained of their forces, further demoralized the soldiers and contributed to the growing sense that the war was lost. The political consequences of the military disaster became increasingly severe. Prime Minister Paolo Boselli, whose government had overseen the Italian war effort during the previous months, found his position untenable. The scale of the defeat, the capture of so many soldiers, and the rapid loss of territory created a political crisis in addition to the military one. Within days of the breakthrough, the Boselli government resigned, and a new government under Vittorio Orlando took power. Orlando, a politician with a reputation for toughness and political acumen, faced the task of stabilizing both the military situation and the home front. The change in government reflected the depth of the crisis. This was not merely a military setback, but a fundamental challenge to Italian national confidence. The retreat continued through the first 2 weeks of November. Italian forces, harassed constantly by German and Austro-Hungarian pursuit, fell back toward the Piave River. The roads were choked with refugees fleeing the combat zone, with wounded soldiers attempting to reach medical facilities, and with military personnel trying to maintain some semblance of organization. The civilian population of the areas being evacuated experienced their own catastrophe. Families were separated as men were conscripted for labor or military service. Homes were abandoned, and the accumulated possessions of generations were left behind. The psychological impact on the Italian home front was severe. Not only was Italy losing the war militarily, but Italian territory was being invaded and occupied by enemy forces. By the 10th of November, the Italian retreat had reached the Piave River line. This final defensive position, which military planners had long identified as the ultimate point beyond which retreat was impossible, became the focus of desperate defensive efforts. The Piave represented more than a geographical feature. It represented the final barrier before the approach to Venice and the industrial heartland of northern Italy. If the Piave line broke, the war for Italy would be effectively lost. The German and Austro-Hungarian commanders, recognizing the significance of this position, prepared to assault it. However, the advance of the Central Powers forces had now begun to encounter logistical difficulties. The rapid pace of the offensive had stretched supply lines thin. The German and Austro-Hungarian forces, having advanced more than 25 kilometers into Italian territory, found themselves operating further and further from their bases of supply. The Italian forces, meanwhile, had the advantage of defending a position close to their own supply lines and reinforcement centers. Though battered and demoralized, the Italian army had not been completely destroyed. Units that had managed to retreat from the Caporetto breakthrough began to consolidate around the Piave River. General Armando Diaz, who had assumed command of Italian forces following the dismissal of General Luigi Cadorna, recognized that the Piave line had to be held. Diaz, a career military officer with extensive experience in mountain warfare, began the process of reorganizing the Italian defense. He relieved officers who had lost the confidence of their men, reorganized units to restore cohesion, and attempted to restore morale through a combination of discipline and recognition of the soldiers' sacrifices. The crisis extended beyond the purely military sphere. The massive number of prisoners taken by the Central Powers created a humanitarian catastrophe in its own right. These soldiers, many of whom had been captured while disorganized and confused, found themselves marched into captivity. The conditions of captivity varied, but many prisoners faced difficult circumstances, inadequate food, and harsh treatment. The knowledge that so many Italian soldiers were in enemy hands added to the sense of national disaster. Families throughout Italy received notices that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been captured. Some would survive captivity and return after the war. Others would not survive the experience. The international dimensions of the crisis also became apparent. The Italian defeat raised serious questions about the viability of the Allied cause in Europe. Britain and France had been relying on the Italian front to tie down Central Powers forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. The sudden collapse of Italian military capability forced the Allies to reconsider their strategic situation. British and French military observers sent to Italy to assess the situation reported on the depth of the crisis. However, both Britain and France were themselves exhausted by years of war. The possibility of providing substantial reinforcements to Italy was limited. The Italian army would have to recover on its own or face the prospect of complete military collapse. The battle itself, as a distinct military operation, continued through November and into December. The Central Powers forces, attempting to break through the Piave line, launched a series of assaults. The Italian defenders, fighting now with their backs to their own territory, resisted with increasing determination. The advantage that the Central Powers had possessed in terms of tactical innovation and initial surprise began to diminish as the fighting became more conventional. The Piave River, wider and more formidable than the Tagliamento, proved more difficult to cross. Italian forces, now fighting from prepared positions and with reinforcements arriving, began to stabilize the line. By mid-November, the German and Austro-Hungarian offensive had begun to lose momentum. The supply difficulties that had been building throughout the campaign became increasingly acute. By December, the campaign phase of what became known as the Battle of Caporetto was effectively concluded. The Central Powers forces had achieved a remarkable tactical and operational success. They had broken through the Italian line, driven the Italian army back more than 25 kilometers, captured an enormous number of prisoners, and forced a complete reorganization of the Italian military and political leadership. Yet they had failed to achieve their ultimate objective of destroying the Italian army or forcing Italy to withdraw from the war. The Piave River line, which had seemed so fragile in November, had held. The Italian army, though battered and reduced in strength, had maintained its existence as an organized military force. The human cost of the crisis was immense and extended far beyond the immediate casualty figures. The 10,000 killed and 30,000 wounded represented individual tragedies multiplied across the nation. The 265,000 prisoners represented a generation of Italian youth removed from their families and their homeland. The displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians created a humanitarian crisis that would take years to resolve. The psychological impact on the Italian home front was profound. The nation that had entered the war with hopes of glory and territorial expansion now faced the humiliation of military defeat and occupation of its own territory. The crisis of Caporetto represented a turning point not merely in the military campaign but in the entire Italian experience of the First World War. Before Caporetto, the Italian war effort had been characterized by grinding attrition and limited territorial gains. The Italian soldier had become a symbol of endurance in the face of impossible circumstances. After Caporetto, the Italian war effort would be characterized by desperation and the struggle to avoid complete collapse. The nation's leadership would be forced to confront fundamental questions about the viability of continued warfare and the possibility of negotiated peace. The crisis had revealed the fragility of Italian military organization and the limits of national resolve when faced with catastrophic defeat. The withdrawal to the Piave River line, completed by approximately the 10th of November in 1917, represented far more than a military retreat. It marked the moment when Italy confronted the true cost of its ambitions on the Isonzo front. What had begun 2 years earlier as a campaign to seize territory and achieve glory had transformed into a desperate scramble for survival. The soldiers who reached the Piave, those who reached it at all, carried with them not the pride of warriors, but the hollow exhaustion of men who had witnessed the machinery of modern warfare consume everything they held dear. The final casualty figures emerged slowly, tallied by military clerks in makeshift offices far from the sound of artillery. Approximately 10,000 Italian soldiers had been killed in the initial breakthrough and subsequent collapse. Another 30,000 lay wounded in field hospitals, many of them destined to carry the marks of Caporetto for the remainder of their lives. But the most staggering number, the one that would haunt Italian leadership for generations, was the 265,000 prisoners of war. 250,000 men, captured in the chaos of retreat, now marched into captivity toward camps in Austria-Hungary and German-occupied territories. These were not soldiers who had surrendered in shame, but rather men whose units had been shattered so completely that organized resistance became impossible. They were the visible manifestation of catastrophe. General Luigi Cadorna, the architect of the Isonzo offensives, understood immediately that his time as commander had ended. In the immediate aftermath of the breakthrough, as the full scope of the disaster became apparent, Cadorna issued an order on the 29th of October that blamed the collapse not on tactical failure or overwhelming enemy strength, but on the cowardice and indiscipline of the troops themselves. He claimed that soldiers had abandoned their positions without orders, that units had dissolved into panicked mobs, that the army itself had betrayed the nation. This interpretation, whether born from genuine belief or from a desperate need to deflect responsibility, would shape the narrative of Caporetto for decades to come. Yet, the historical record, examined by scholars across multiple generations, reveals a far more complex reality. The stormtrooper tactics employed by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that the Italian command structure had neither anticipated nor trained its soldiers to counter. The infiltration methods, the use of gas and grenade bombardment, the exploitation of fog and surprise, these were not merely tactical innovations, but represented a fundamental shift in how modern armies conducted offensive operations. The Italian troops, exhausted by years of attritional warfare, equipped with outdated defensive doctrines and positioned in vulnerable salients, had been asked to hold against tactics that few armies in Europe could have resisted. The political consequences in Rome were swift and seismic. Prime Minister Paolo Boselli's government fell within days, replaced by a new cabinet under Vittorio Orlando, a man whose political acumen and determination would prove essential in the months ahead. Orlando understood that Italy's survival as a combatant nation depended not merely on military recovery, but on restoring the morale and confidence of both the army and the civilian population. The removal of Cadorna from his position as commander-in-chief came as an inevitable consequence of the disaster. He was replaced by General Armando Diaz, a figure who would become synonymous with the redemption of Italian military honor. Diaz inherited an army in profound crisis. The retreat to the Piave River line had halted further enemy advances, but the psychological damage extended far deeper than any territorial loss. Soldiers whispered of betrayal, of commanders who had squandered their lives for meaningless objectives. Officers questioned whether the chain of command could be trusted. The civilian population, learning of the scale of the defeat, wondered whether Italy's participation in the war had become a catastrophic mistake. The newspapers, carefully controlled though they were, could not entirely suppress the reality of what had transpired along the Isonzo. The Piave River itself became a symbol of Italian resistance and determination. Where the Isonzo had been the site of 12 massive offensives that accomplished nothing but the accumulation of corpses, the Piave represented a defensive line that could be held. The terrain along the river was considerably more favorable for defense than the limestone plateaus and mountain passes of the Isonzo region. The river itself, swollen by November rains, provided a natural obstacle to enemy advance. More importantly, the Piave line was shorter, requiring fewer troops to defend. which allowed Italian commanders to concentrate their forces more effectively. In the weeks following the stabilization of the front, General Diaz undertook a methodical reconstruction of the Italian army's fighting capacity. He implemented new training protocols that incorporated lessons learned from the stormtrooper breakthrough. He reorganized the command structure, removing officers who had lost the confidence of their men and promoting those who demonstrated both tactical competence and genuine concern for the welfare of their troops. He established clearer lines of communication between the front and headquarters, ensuring that intelligence about enemy movements and intentions could be rapidly disseminated. Perhaps most crucially, he worked to restore a sense of purpose and meaning to the sacrifice that Italian soldiers were being asked to make. The British and French, initially shocked by the magnitude of the Italian collapse, moved quickly to provide military assistance. British divisions were dispatched to the Italian front to bolster the Piave line. French units were positioned to support the left flank of the Italian positions. This international support served a dual purpose. It provided immediate military reinforcement at a critical moment, and it demonstrated to Italian soldiers and civilians alike that their nation remained part of the broader Allied coalition. They were not abandoned, they were not fighting alone. The winter of 1917 into 1918 became a period of consolidation and recovery. The front lines stabilized along the Piave. The enemy, having achieved their initial breakthrough, found that further advance became increasingly difficult. The supply lines that had stretched across the captured territory became vulnerable to Italian counterattacks and harassment. The very success of the initial offensive created new problems for the Central Powers, as they were forced to garrison and provision vast stretches of newly conquered territory. Within the prisoner of war camps, the 265,000 captured Italian soldiers endured conditions that ranged from merely harsh to genuinely catastrophic. Many were transported to camps in the Austro-Hungarian interior, where they labored in mines, factories, and agricultural work. They were separated from their families for years, receiving only occasional letters and packages from home. Some did not survive the captivity, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or the psychological weight of their circumstances. Yet within these camps, something remarkable occurred. The prisoners, stripped of their military ranks and positions, began to organize themselves into informal communities. They shared what little food they received, supported one another through illness and despair, and maintained the bonds of comradeship that had been forged in the trenches and on the mountain slopes of the Isonzo. The official Italian inquiries into the causes of the Caporetto disaster began almost immediately, though they would continue for months and even years. Military courts-martial examined the conduct of officers and men. Political committees investigated the chain of command decisions that had led to the vulnerability of the front. Historians and military analysts attempted to construct narratives that could explain how such a catastrophic defeat had occurred. The conclusions were complicated and sometimes contradictory. Some blamed the troops for lacking discipline and courage. Others pointed to the failure of the high command to recognize the threat or to position reserves adequately. Still others emphasized the revolutionary nature of the German stormtrooper tactics and the simple fact that the Italian army, like many armies in 1917, had not yet fully adapted to the realities of modern industrial warfare. The human stories that emerged from Caporetto became woven into the fabric of Italian national memory. There were tales of individual acts of courage, soldiers who held their positions to the last man, officers who died with their units rather than flee to safety. There were also stories of breakdown and panic, of men who abandoned their posts, of units that disintegrated under pressure. These narratives were often contradictory, each reflecting the perspective of the person telling the story. A soldier who retreated with his unit might speak of a tactical withdrawal executed under difficult circumstances. An officer from a unit that held its ground might describe cowardice and treachery. The reality, as is often the case in military history, encompassed elements of all these narratives. The literary and cultural responses to Caporetto would extend far beyond the immediate post-war period. Prominent Italian writers and intellectuals grappled with the meaning and significance of the defeat. Some viewed it as a national humiliation that demanded explanation and redemption. Others saw in it evidence of deeper problems within Italian society and politics. The novelist Ernest Hemingway, who served as an ambulance driver on the Italian front, would later draw on his experiences of the retreat to create some of the most memorable passages in his novel, A Farewell to Arms. His depiction of the Italian army's collapse, published in 1929, would become one of the most widely known literary treatments of Caporetto, though it would also prove controversial among Italian readers who felt it perpetuated simplistic stereotypes about Italian military performance. The military recovery that General Diaz orchestrated proved successful. By the spring of 1918, the Italian army had regained much of its fighting capacity. The reforms in training, organization, and leadership had begun to produce results. Morale, though still fragile, had begun to recover. The presence of British and French forces, combined with the stabilization of the front, provided reassurance that Italy's military position, while precarious, was no longer in immediate danger of complete collapse. The soldiers who had survived Caporetto and the retreat to the Piave had learned harsh lessons about modern warfare. They understood now that victory would not come from heroic charges or desperate offensives launched against entrenched positions. It would come, if it came at all, from disciplined application of superior resources and tactics. The final phase of the war on the Italian front would see the Central Powers attempt one more major offensive in the spring of 1918. The Battle of the Piave, fought in June of that year, would see the Italian army, now under Diaz's command and strengthened by the reforms he had implemented, successfully defend their positions and even launch counterattacks that pushed the enemy back. This victory, limited though it was in scope, carried enormous symbolic importance. It demonstrated that Italian soldiers could stand against the Central Powers. It showed that the army had learned from the catastrophe of Caporetto. It provided evidence that the sacrifices made along the Isonzo and at the Piave had not been entirely in vain. The final collapse of the Central Powers came in the autumn of 1918. As Germany's military situation deteriorated and Austria-Hungary began to disintegrate, the pressure on the Italian front decreased. By the time of the armistice in November, the Italian army was positioned to advance into territory previously held by the Austro-Hungarian forces. The war that had consumed so much Italian blood and treasure was finally ending. The soldiers who had survived Caporetto, the retreat, the long years of attritional warfare, and the final campaigns could at last contemplate a return to civilian life. The legacy of Caporetto extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences. The battle and its aftermath raised fundamental questions about the nature of modern warfare, the relationship between military leadership and the soldiers under their command, and the psychological and social costs of industrialized conflict. The 265,000 prisoners of war represented not merely a military loss, but a tragedy of individual human beings separated from their families and homes for years. The 10,000 killed and 30,000 wounded carried permanent physical and psychological scars. The millions of civilians who had supported the war effort through taxation, rationing, and sacrifice began to question whether the costs had been justified by the results. The official inquiries and investigations that followed Caporetto established important precedents for how military defeats would be analyzed and explained. Rather than accepting simple narratives of cowardice or heroism, historians and military analysts increasingly examined the complex interplay of tactical, strategic, technological, and organizational factors that had contributed to the outcome. This more nuanced approach to military history would influence how subsequent conflicts were studied and understood. The survivors of Caporetto carried their experiences forward into the post-war world. Many would struggle with what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress. The psychological wounds inflicted by the experience of combat, retreat, and the fear of death would manifest in ways that the medicine and psychology of the 1920s were ill-equipped to address. Veterans organizations emerged to provide mutual support and to advocate for the recognition and compensation of those who had suffered. These organizations would play important roles in Italian politics and society throughout the interwar period. The Piave River, which had become the line of Italian defense and redemption after the catastrophe of Caporetto, would itself become a symbol of Italian national identity. The phrase Difesa del Piave, the defense of the Piave, entered Italian historical consciousness as a moment when the nation had stood firm against overwhelming odds. This narrative, while containing elements of truth, also served to somewhat obscure the deeper lessons of Caporetto itself. The battle had not been lost because Italian soldiers lacked courage or because the nation lacked will. It had been lost because the Italian army, like many armies in the Great War, had been unprepared for the tactical innovations of modern warfare and had been positioned in a vulnerable configuration by strategic decisions made by the High Command. The immediate aftermath of Caporetto saw the Italian government take measures to restore public confidence. Official communiques emphasized the stabilization of the front and the determination to continue the war. Propaganda efforts highlighted the bravery of soldiers and the incompetence of the enemy. Gradually, the narrative of catastrophic defeat was reframed into a narrative of survival against odds and eventual recovery. This process of historical reconstruction and reinterpretation would continue for decades, with different political movements and governments emphasizing different aspects of the Caporetto experience to serve their own ideological purposes. By the time of the armistice in November of 1918, Italy had achieved the territorial objectives that had motivated its entry into the war. The Austro-Hungarian territories that Italy had sought to acquire were coming within reach, yet the cost had been staggering. Estimates suggest that Italy had suffered more than 600,000 casualties in total during the war, including killed, wounded, and missing. The economic burden of the war effort had left the nation with enormous debts and a population exhausted by years of sacrifice and rationing. The social cohesion that had existed at the beginning of the war had fractured under the strain of seemingly endless conflict and mounting losses. The Caporetto disaster, viewed from the perspective of the final years of the war, came to be seen as a turning point not because it was immediately catastrophic, but because it forced both the Italian military and political leadership to confront fundamental questions about how the war was being conducted and what could realistically be achieved. The reforms implemented by General Diaz, the reorganization of the command structure, and the renewed emphasis on training and preparation represented a learning process that, while painful, ultimately contributed to the Italian army's improved performance in the final year of the war. The historical significance of Caporetto extends beyond Italy itself. The battle demonstrated to all the major combatants on the Western Front that the static trench warfare that had characterized the middle years of the Great War could be broken through by armies that possessed the tactical innovation, the element of surprise, and the sufficient concentration of force. The German stormtrooper tactics that had proven so devastating on the Isonzo would be employed again on the Western Front in the spring of 1918. The lessons learned by Italian commanders about defending against these tactics would inform the defensive strategies employed by the French and British as they prepared for the German spring offensives. As the 20th century progressed, and scholars continued to examine the Great War with increasing sophistication, Caporetto came to be recognized as a crucial moment in military history. It represented both the vulnerability of armies that had not adapted to modern warfare and the remarkable resilience of military organizations and human beings when confronted with catastrophe. The soldiers who had survived the breakthrough, the retreat, and the long years of captivity had learned lessons about survival, adaptation, and human endurance that transcended the specific context of military conflict. The prisoners of war who were eventually repatriated after the armistice returned to an Italy that had been transformed by the war. The social fabric had been torn apart, the political system was fractured and unstable, the economic situation was dire. Many of the returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The bonds of comradeship forged in the trenches and maintained through the ordeal of captivity were often insufficient to bridge the gap between the world of the soldier and the world of the civilian. Some turned to political activism, seeking to ensure that the sacrifices they had made would be recognized and honored. Others simply attempted to rebuild their lives and move forward, carrying their memories and their wounds in silence. The legacy of Caporetto ultimately rests not in any single interpretation or narrative, but in the complex human reality of modern warfare. It stands as a testament to both the fragility and the resilience of military organizations, to the capacity of human beings to endure seemingly unbearable circumstances, and to the profound costs that warfare imposes on individuals, families, and nations. The 265,000 prisoners, the 10,000 killed, the 30,000 wounded, these were not merely statistics in a military campaign. They were individuals whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the events of those few days in October of 1917. Their stories, collectively and individually, form the true legacy of Caporetto, a legacy that reminds us of the human price of conflict and the importance of learning from history's most difficult lessons. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, exploring these incredible World War I stories. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. I'd love to hear what you think about this chapter of history. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts or share any questions you have. We've got so many more fascinating stories from the Great War coming your way, and I can't wait to share them with you. History is all around us, waiting to be discovered, so stay curious and keep learning. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you next time.